Hey everyone, welcome to Malta 5. I'm JD, and as usual, I'm here playing the jankiest Tier 3 Spicy Rogue Brews for your viewing pleasure. First things first, if you enjoy what we do here, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It's a quick and easy way to show your support and help out the channel. We'd really appreciate it. Also, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Main Phase Media. These videos would not be possible without them, so please check them out for all your graphic design and video production needs. And finally, if you have your own janky masterpiece you'd like to see me play, go ahead and leave a comment, or you can shoot an email to the address in the description below. And now we'll get to the deck tech. Today we're doing another Tribal Tuesday. And today's Faeries, and actually mono blue Faeries. And this is like one of my favorite tribes, because it's one of my favorite play styles. I love tempo decks, and that's what Faeries is all about. Super tricky, kind of disrupting your opponent while getting in for a little evasive damage in the air. So I love Faeries. Now, even like a fully powered blue-black Faeries deck is still maybe tier 2, tier 3, tier 2. And we're on mono blue because, I mean, on this channel, I'm not trying to play the best and most powerful decks. I'm trying to have fun while staying semi on a budget. So, you know, if you like this deck, if you really enjoy this playstyle and you want to make this your modern deck, I would recommend going blue-black, because that is the better of the two options. More pricey, but it's better. You get Bitter Blossom. You get access to black removal and Thoughtseize and all that fun stuff. So I would go blue-black, and even if you stick mono blue, you could even throw some Cryptic Commands in here. You could throw Snapcaster Mage in here. There's some pricier cards that could go in here to maybe power it up a little bit, but I'm sticking on the lower side of the budget for today. So anyway, mono blue Faeries. Let's see. I guess we'll start right at the top with kind of the biggest payoff for Faeries, which is Mistbind Click. This is the most powerful card in the deck. So it's a 4/4 flyer for 4, which is already pretty solid. It has flash. The downside / upside is you have to champion a fairy. So when it enters the battlefield, you have to sacrifice it unless you exile another fairy instead. When Mistbind Click leaves, the exiled fairy comes back, so it's not gone forever. So you have to have another fairy on the battlefield to champion. And if you just have one fairy and your opponent kills off that fairy in response to you casting Mistbind, and now when Mistbind resolves, there's no other fairies left to champion, it just fizzles and dies immediately. So you got to be careful when you play it, but if you have a couple fairies on the battlefield, or you're sure your opponent has no removal and the coast is clear, it's super powerful, because when a fairy is championed with Mistbind Click, tap all lands target player controls. So generally the way you play Mistbind is on the opponent's upkeep. So they untap, in their upkeep you flash it in and tap down all their lands for the turn. So it's basically a time walk. They could maybe play with whatever's already on the battlefield, or if they have some instant speed, something they can do in their upkeep, great, but generally you're really screwing up their whole turn. So super disruptive, and then you're left with a 4/4 flying body on the battlefield, which is a very fast clock. So Mistbind Click is amazing. So we can move right down along here. In the 3-drop slot, we got Pestermite. Again, flash, flying. That's going to be a theme. First of all, the fairies fly, which is great. So even though they're small, they're evasive, so they can get in for damage here and there. But they also have flash. So this deck plays almost completely at instant speed. So you're generally not doing much, or not casting spells, I should say, during your own turn. You want to be waiting, holding up mana, and flashing things in at the end of your opponent's turn. So you could be holding counter spells, which I'll get to in a minute. So if your opponent casts something that you need to counter, you can counter it. If they don't, you can just flash in your creatures. So you're playing with maximum information and giving your opponent the least amount of information. So flash and flying is kind of what makes all these fairies powerful. Pestermite's kind of unique ability is when it enters the battlefield, you may tap or untap any permanent. So you could flash this guy in at the beginning of combat, and either, if it's on your turn, you could tap down an opponent's blocker, so your guys can get in for damage. If it's combat on your opponent's turn, you could flash it in and tap down one of their attackers, so it can't get in to attack you. You could flash it in on their upkeep and tap down just one of their lands. Not as good as Mistbind, tacking down all of them, but even just making them lose a land for the turn can slow them down a little bit. It's a small advantage. Or you could untap one of your own lands after you cast it. Say you only have 3 lands out. Play the Pestermite, untap one of your islands, and now all of a sudden you can play a 1-drop or hold up mana for a Vapor Snag or whatever. So Pestermite has a lot of different uses and can be a pretty good card. The other 3-drop is Scion of Una, which is our Lord. Again, flash, flying. It's only a 1/1, but all other fairies get +1/+1. So it's making all our guys a little bit bigger, which is super helpful because, like I said, most of them are pretty small. So a 1/1 is a 20-turn clock. A 2/2 is only a 10-turn clock. And so when you have a couple 2/2s out, it adds up a lot faster than just having really low-powered guys. So Sign of Una is great. The better Lord effect, though, is probably that all other fairies have Shroud, which is the old version of Hexproof. So they can't be targets of spells or abilities. The only thing with Shroud is you can't target them either. They can't be targeted by your opponent or you. So Shroud is generally great. However, it now means like you can't save one of your own creatures from removal with a Vapor Snag because you can't target them anymore. So generally, Shroud is fine. Hexproof would obviously be better. Shroud's pretty cool. It's just it does mess up a few interactions that we have in our own deck. But generally the benefit totally outweighs the downside. You can flash this guy in response to removal, make the removal spell fizzle, targeted removal, I should say, etc. So Sign of Una, our Lord. In the 2-drop slot, we have a couple 1-ofs, etc. There's some interesting things in here. Military Intelligence is just a 1-of. Whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, draw a card. And so with all our little fairies which have evasion, we generally can attack in with flyers pretty easily. So hopefully we're triggering Military Intelligence often and drawing cards into more gas, keeping up the card advantage. It doesn't synergize. It's not a fairy. I mean, I definitely don't want to see more than one of them. I mean, I guess they do stack, so more than one would be cool, but it's probably getting a little greedy. So it's just a 1-of. Quickling is a 2/2 for 2, so pretty good stats for a fairy. Flash, flying again. However, similar to Mistbind Click, when it enters the battlefield, you have to sacrifice it unless you bounce another creature you control to its owner's hand. So this is a downside and an upside, potentially, depending on the situation. You can't play Quickling into an empty battlefield if you have nothing else to return. So that's a downside. However, you can use it similar to a Vapor Snag. You can flash it in response to someone trying to kill one of your other creatures, bounce it back to your hand and save it. You can, just for value, bounce back like a Fairy Miscreant to replay, to maybe draw another card, etc. So I only included 2 of them because it can be useful, but it can also be kind of annoying playing into an empty board. Remand, we're a tempo deck. Remand is the best tempo card. It's a hard counter, but it goes back to their hand instead of their graveyard, but we draw a card. So we're drawn into more gas to deal with the threat when it comes back. We're just delaying them, time walking them. Remand's an amazing tempo spell. Spell Stutter Sprite is one of the other big reasons to play fairies. It's a 1/1 flash flyer for 2. And when it enters the battlefield, counter target spell with converted mana cost X or less, where X is the number of fairies you control. So this spell scales with the more fairies you have. even if you have a totally empty board, Spell Stutter Sprite does count itself when it resolves. So even playing into a totally empty board, Spell Stutter Sprite can counter a 1-drop, which is pretty good. There's a decent amount of 1-drops out there. Ancient Stirrings, Lightning Bolts, whatever. There's a Thoughtseize. There's all kinds of them. So it's pretty good. Now, as soon as you have another fairy on board, you can now counter 2-drops. And then if we have a really good board presence, 3-drops or 4-drops. And at that point, it's pretty much a hard counter for most things in Modern. Spell Stutter Sprite, pretty amazing. I have another one of in here, Familiar's Ruse. It's another counter spell. The only thing is we have to, similar to Quickling, you have to return a creature you control to its owner's hand. So it's a hard counter for double blue. The downside is you have to bounce something. So if you've got nothing on board, it's kind of dead in hand. So I just have the one of them. And then Smuggler's Copter seems weird. It's not a fairy. It doesn't seem like it really would fit well. But it's a 3/3 flyer that loots. So we can throw away dead cards. We can draw into the stuff we need. And crewing it up is pretty easy because we have all these little 1-drop, 1/1 weak little flyers that we would much rather let them sit on the battlefield to help out Spell Stutter Sprite. But if we can use them to power up a Smuggler's Copter and swing for 3 in the air instead of 1 in the air, it seems great. So Smuggler's Copter does some work in this deck. Then the Fairy Miscreant, it's a 1/1 for 1 flyer. It has a small upside occasionally. If there's another one on the battlefield already, you get to draw a card when you cast it. So it's literally the best option for our 1-drops. Second best option is Zephyr Sprite. It's a 1/1 flyer for 1. Pretty basic, but helps crew up Copter. It helps power up Spell Stutter Sprite. It's something for Mistbind, Click the Champion, etc., etc. You kind of want a critical mass of fairies in this deck. So threw in a couple Zephyr Sprites to fill in the gaps. And then there's Vapor Snag, another great tempo spell in a tempo style deck. For just 1 mana, you can bounce back their 3 or 4-drop and really kind of set them back. So they have to replay, waste a turn basically. So Vapor Snag's great. The mana base, we have some creature lands, because again, we want a critical mass of fairies. So we have Mutavault and Fairy Conclave. Both 2-man lands. They both have their pros and cons. Fairy Conclave taps for blue, which is great, but it costs 2 mana to power up. And Mutavault only taps for colorless, but it just costs 1 colorless to power up. So Mutavault's probably the better one. Fairy Conclave does fly, so that, again, pros and cons. Field of Ruin, we have a couple copies of those. Take care of Tron lands and Celestial Colonnades and blue-white control, etc. Bunch of basic islands and 1 Oboro, which has a couple niche abilities. You can bounce it back to hand to discard to a Liliana trigger or something. You can use it to fix your mana. If you need double blue to cast stuff, you can, tap it for blue, use some colorless Mutavault mana to bounce it back, replay it as your land for turn and get the double blue, etc. So it has some kind of very narrow uses, but it comes in untapped and it taps for blue. So it's basically an island. Plays around Choke and Boil technically. Does not play around Blood Moon, but we have plenty of basics otherwise, so it's kind of like a why not card. We're running 23 lands because we are kind of a control deck, tempo-y control. We're not super aggressive. We really want to be countering all their stuff and vapor snagging things back, and so we want to make sure we hit our land drops. Sideboard, Ceremonious Rejection acts to kind of pulls double duty as Artifact Hate and Tron Hate. I'd bring it in against Hardened Scales or anything like that, or against Tron, counter their big Karns and Wormcoil Engines and that sort of thing. Relic of Progenitus fights against the graveyard decks, Echoing Truth kind of catches, can bounce Planeswalkers, it can bounce Ensnaring Bridge, it can bounce whatever, kind of anything. It's a good one of. Dragon's Claw against the burn decks. They are, burns scary, they're fast, they do a lot of damage. We have a hard time keeping up in the tempo with them, so hopefully Dragon's Claw will ease that a little bit. Ratchet Bomb, another, it's good against tokens, it's good against like slippery bogles. You can destroy all the auras attached to it and it itself since it doesn't target, etc. So Ratchet Bomb has some multiple uses. And Dismember, some hard removal. We really only have bounce effects and counter spells, so if a big creature sticks, we want to have some way to actually get rid of it for good. If there's some threatening creatures out there, this is the best we have in mono blue for a hard removal spell. So that is the deck. I love this style of deck. I think it's going to be super fun. I love tempo decks. It's not the most powerful, so unless you really love this style of deck, maybe this isn't for you, but I'm super excited. It's pretty cheap, especially on MTGO, so we are going to take this to a friendly Modern League and see how we do. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the first match.